Welcome back, Capital F football fans, to the O&O Sports YouTube channel. Today, we are taking a look at who I think are the top 10 quarterbacks going into the 2026 college football season. As always, if you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe. It helps me out a ton. And if you have any disagreements with this list, be sure to drop a comment down below. Let me know your top 10 quarterbacks going into next season. And without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. But first, let's take a look at my honorable mentions. The three quarterbacks I was close to putting on this list, but ultimately decided not to, are Brendan Sorsby, now of Texas Tech, Byron Brown, now of Auburn, and Drew Mestemaker, now of Oklahoma State. All three transfer quarterbacks, go figure. And these are all guys who, in my opinion, ended up in very, very good situations. You have Brendan Sorsby at Texas Tech, now a juggernaut in the Big 12. Byron Brown follows Alex Galesh and his offense to the Auburn Tigers. And Drew Mestemaker, the same, ends up at Oklahoma State with Eric Morris. All these guys are also very, very talented, quite obviously, if they're even mentioned in correlation with a top 10 quarterback list. Some questions I have for these guys going into next season, though, is just about their pure efficiency and their output going into next season. With a guy like Sorsby, is he as good as he was at Cincinnati now that he's probably going to make up less of the total offense? With Brown jumping from South Florida to the SEC, does it have an effect? Do his efficiency numbers end up dipping because of that talent jump? And Mestemaker jumping to Oklahoma State, I think they could be a lot better, but in year one of what will likely be a pretty solid rebuild for the Cowboys, does he replicate some of those numbers that he had at North Texas? These are just some of the questions I had for these guys, which ultimately led me to leaving them off of my top 10 list. Like I said, all very talented, but just short of that top 10. But at 10, I have Indiana's Josh Hoover. And this could be shocking to some. I think he's probably top 20 to top 15 for most people. But I am just following trends here in 2024. They bring in Curtis Rourke, who lights it up, leads them to one of their best seasons in program history. And the following season, of course, Fernando Mendoza comes in, leads them to their best season in program history and winning the national championship. He wins the Heisman, and now they bring in who is probably the most talented from an arm talent perspective in Josh Hoover, which might sound a bit shocking to some, but in terms of efficiency, in terms of raw production coming into Indiana, he is by far the best. He spent 3 years at TCU where he developed his game, looked very, very solid last year. But one thing about Josh Hoover, in order for him to become an elite quarterback, which I don't think he is just yet, he's got to clean up the turnovers. In the past 3 seasons, 33 interceptions. Now, I'm not a math whiz, but that sounds like 11 interceptions per year, which isn't the greatest. But coming into a Mike Shanahan offense at Indiana, I think that is a very complimentary offense to walk into, as we've seen with the last 2 quarterbacks they've gotten. Their efficiency numbers, their turnover numbers have gotten way, way better when joining that system. I think the talent of Josh Hoover and the system of Mike Shanahan will mesh perfectly. I think that leads to his best season by far in his career so far. I do have my reservations about Hoover and this Indiana team altogether. They're in a bit of an overhaul, but we saw Indiana win the national championship with Curt Cignetti, so I don't think anything is off the table here. And if all goes well, if Indiana can get back to the top of the Big Ten, back in the playoff, I think Josh Hoover could very well end up in New York this year. And next at number 9, we have Arch Manning of Texas. And speaking of having reservations on quarterbacks, here we are with Arch Manning. And if you're a fan of the channel, you recognize last year I was very, very high on Arch Manning, high enough to have him as my Heisman Trophy pick going into last year. Obviously, that didn't come to fruition, but he was still very, very good last season, especially towards the end of the year. My biggest things with Arch Manning is he just has to be more consistent as a passer, has to be more accurate overall if he wants to take that next jump into a Heisman finalist. But overall, he's already an elite playmaker. My biggest worry for him is the system, if they're going to cater to that capability more so than they did last year. You could tell last year it was kind of awkward. They wanted him to stay in the pocket, deliver some great throws, which he just wasn't super capable of at times, very inconsistent at times throughout his first season as a starter. But we saw multiple times throughout his career, multiple times last season, a couple times the year before, and against Michigan in their bowl game, he has elite dual threat capability. I think they need to lean into that more if they want to maximize his capability as a Power 4, as an SEC starting quarterback. But all around him, I think Texas Texas actually improves on offense. I won't say they get better as a whole overall, but I think they definitely improve as an offense. They retain a ton of snaps on the offensive line. They get elite running backs, which was a big issue for them last year. Running the ball wasn't always easy for them, but they get Hollywood Smothers from NC State. They get Raleek Brown from ASU to help bolster that running back room. That wasn't bad last year, but I definitely think they take a step up. And on top of that, at wide receiver, they add Cam Coleman, who has all-American upside at the wideout position. He's going into next season as potentially one of the best wide receivers in the sport, which will obviously help Arch Manning's numbers a ton. And like I said, if they lean into that dual threat ability, I think his numbers soar in 2026, and he very well could end up as a Heisman finalist. And after him at number 8, it is Sam Leavitt, now of LSU. Might be a little low depending on who you ask. He was a top 2 player in the transfer portal this last portal cycle. Obviously took the world by storm in 2024, where he helps Arizona go to the playoff, almost beat Texas in an upset in that college football playoff, win the Big 12 in 2024. But in 2025, he takes a step back, both due to losing key players, namely Cam Skattebo on offense, as well as having a ton of injuries. And for me, this is a kind of wait and see spot for Sam Leavitt. I obviously think he's super talented. I think he fits the mold of a Lane Kiffin offense immensely, but with those nagging injuries having a big impact on his play last year, and with him just being generally inefficient as a passer, I once again have my reservations on his play overall as a quarterback. With the talent now around him at LSU, I think his production numbers end up being pretty solid once again. But as a pure passer, like I said, I'm not super confident. He's just a 60 to 61% passer throughout his career. He was mid-60s in passing EPA last year, which isn't great. Just 6.8 yards per pass attempt. But like I said, with the talent around him, with the scheme around him, I still think his raw production numbers look good at the end of the season if he stays healthy, obviously. Could see a step up as a passer, but for now, I am leaving him at number 8. And at 7, I have Notre Dame's CJ Carr. Another surprise, maybe. I don't think it's very much of a surprise. I think he is one of the best quarterbacks overall in the country. I think we saw that last year. And he does get a little flack, maybe reasonably so, for the schedule he faced last year. Wasn't super difficult all around, but as a redshirt freshman, 67% passing, a 4-to-1 touchdown to interception ratio, 9.4 yards per pass attempt, 14.1 yards per completion, and a 168 passer efficiency rating. And that means outside of his raw numbers, he was very accurate, almost hyper accurate, and very efficient overall. Wasn't afraid to throw the deep ball either. He did a good job spreading the wealth around to all of his wide receivers and a couple of his running backs, which is very rare from a freshman. Usually from these younger quarterbacks, you see them get a target that they like and kind of spam it, kind of just force it to them a lot of the time. But that was not the case for CJ Carr, which is making me very high on him going into next season, obviously. But the question will be if he can stay as efficient as he was as a passer without the lethal run game they had in Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price last year. Obviously, both of those guys leave this season, as well as a couple pieces on offensive line. I think they stay afloat on the ground. I don't think they become bad at running the ball next year necessarily, but obviously, losing 2 guys like that is a big hit for an offense, for any offense in the country. But most importantly for CJ Carr, I trust Marcus Freeman as a head coach, and I trust his offensive coordinator, Mike Denbrock. I think the continuity on offense with the scheme, especially going into his second year as a starter, does well for his numbers once again in 2026. And that's why I have him as my 7th best quarterback going into next season. And at 6, I have Jayden Maiava of USC, one of the hardest placements on this list so far, and that's because Jayden Maiava is obviously very talented. You don't have a 3,800 yard, 30 touchdown season if you aren't very talented, but of course, the biggest question is not if he should be on the list, it is where, because he does lose Jacoby Lane and Makai Lemon. Those 2 wide receivers alone accounted for over 120 receptions last year. They also lose Lake McCree, their tight end. And I talk about this over and over for a ton of these quarterbacks, for a ton of these teams. They're still obviously very talented. I don't want to say they're not talented overall, and he takes a huge step back because of that. But obviously losing your top 2 wide receivers, your safety blanket tight end, it makes me question, are your production numbers going to take a step back in 2026? I feel like that's probably pretty likely overall. I still think he stays within the 32 to 3,500 yard range. I still think he is very efficient in terms of completion percentage, in terms of passer efficiency rating. Would like for him to tone back the interceptions as well. That would obviously make him much higher on the list if he was able to have under 10 interceptions in 2026. But for now, I feel comfortable keeping him in the middle of the pack just because I don't know exactly how his raw production numbers are going to turn out going into next year. And at 5, very similar to Mailata, it is Ohio State's Julian Sayin. Towards the middle of the pack in this list, it is absolutely brutal to rank these quarterbacks. It's very, very hard. He is the 77% man, led the country in completion percentage last season, 3,600 yards and 32 passing touchdowns as well. He was a Heisman finalist, albeit a distant 4th as a Heisman finalist, but elite efficiency, elite accuracy, very, very solid deep ball as well. Most publications that you're going to see, most influencers, most college football pundits are going to have him in their top 3, and reasonably so. Obviously, like I just said, he was very, very good in 2025, but my biggest reservation for him overall and for Ohio State's offense overall is how they look post Brian Hartline. Obviously, he takes the jump to the University of South Florida, and that makes me a bit concerned for them because it's never easy to replace a guy like Brian Hartline. He was very, very good for them the past few seasons as their offensive coordinator. And for Julian Sayin specifically, they bring in Arthur Smith at offensive coordinator to replace Hartline, who is at the very best a run primary offensive coordinator and at the worst an absolute run first offensive guru. And like I just talked about with Jayden Maiava, that could end up taking a huge hit to his production numbers next season. But for the sake of this, I'm still very high on him. Top 5 is not bad at all. I think either way, he does end up towards the top of this list by the end of 2026. And at 4, I have Gunnar Stockton of Georgia. I wasn't very high on him going into last season, and he surpassed every single expectation I had for him. And now I think he probably doesn't get enough credit for the job he did as the quarterback for the Georgia Bulldogs in 2025. 70% passing, 3,300 yards, and 34 touchdowns for Mr. Stockton last season. And like every quarterback on this list, he did benefit from elite playmakers on the perimeter, but I saw some elite throws from Gunnar Stockton, which I was just not expecting overall going into last season. The first one that comes to mind is against Tennessee to London Humphreys to tie the football game. Some miraculous throws from Mr. Stockton, which make me very high on him, seeing as he was a 70% completion percentage quarterback in 2025. And in my opinion, he is the zenith of a dual threat quarterback in college football. Now, he's not running for 1,000 yards, obviously, but he's a guy who can both pass the football very efficiently so, and then he can go in the red zone, run the ball 3 times, fight for extra yards, put his body on the line, and score as a runner. Like I said, he's not a running quarterback necessarily, but he does have both capabilities, and he's effective in both passing and running the football. Now, Georgia does lose a ton of talent, both at wide receiver and on the offensive line, which obviously could have a big impact, like I said, for a ton of these quarterbacks on his raw production stats next season. But I think he is the point guard of this offense. I think the game revolves around him, revolves around his arm and his legs. I think them losing talent actually could do more for his production next season, maybe less so for his arm than his legs. But I think if Georgia can get back to the SEC title game and compete for the conference championship once again, he could end up as a Heisman finalist next year. And moving into our top 3, at 3, we have Ole Miss's Trinidad Chambliss, which is funny because he ends up being top 3 when a month ago or a month and a half ago, he wasn't even projected to come back to Ole Miss. Obviously, that is a whole other can of worms that I'm not going to get into in this video. And this is another tough placement for me because going off of 2025 stats, he could be number 1 in all honesty. But with losing his head coach, losing his offensive coordinator, a ton of playmakers both at wide receiver and on the offensive line at Ole Miss, he could end up finishing outside of the top 10. Obviously, overall, I think Ole Miss probably takes a decent step back overall as a program. I think they could end up still with 8 or 9 wins this year. It all depends really on how that offense shakes out. But obviously, retaining Trinidad Chambliss is huge. I think his production stays strong once again, just because, like I have said for a ton of these quarterbacks, his ability as a dual threat really allows him to transcend overall as a player when you're able to make plays both with your arm and on the ground. And on top of that, they retain Kewan Lacey, which is going to be huge once again for this offense. He was one of the better running backs overall in the sport last year. Like I said, there is a huge range for Trinidad Chambliss overall just because of how Ole Miss is about to shake out as a program. There's still a lot of question marks all around, but something that is undeniable is that this guy, Trinidad Chambliss, is one of the best playmakers overall in the sport, and I think just because of his talent alone, he ends up as a top 3 quarterback in 2026. And moving into the top 2, who do we have but Darian Mensah of Miami? And I don't know what's more shocking, having him at number 2 or having him on this list just because of how I have been talking about Miami recently. If you ask Miami fans, it is complete slander, but I have my reservations about them as a program overall going into next season. But the fact of the matter, regardless of my personal opinion on Miami, is that this dude is an absolute phenom. 67% passing on 500 pass attempts last season, led the ACC, one of the best performances all around as a quarterback last season. 4,000 total yards, 34 touchdowns, a 5-to-1 touchdown to interception ratio. And on top of that, he makes the jump to Miami, who historically speaking has done wonders with quarterback talent. They made Carson Beck look like a great quarterback for a majority of last season. They obviously transcended Cam Ward into a number 1 overall type talent at quarterback. And I'm not sure of anyone who isn't high on Darian Mensah at Miami next year, but I personally might be the highest out of all of them. He has Malachi Toney there. He brings in Cooper Barkate. I think that offense could be very fun all around. I think his production numbers will be very, very good to say the least next season. And I think once again, like I just talked about Cam Ward being number 1 overall, I think we see that effect take place on Darian Mensah, where he's obviously very, very good overall, but entering him into this scheme with the structure of an offense like Miami has, I think he transcends that, becomes very, very polished, and could end up being a number 1 overall pick in his own respect. My issues with Miami as a whole obviously fall elsewhere, and whatever I may think of them, I think without a shadow of a doubt that Darian Mensah ends up in New York as a Heisman finalist next season and maybe even winning it. You might be thinking, Colton, if you have him at 2, who could be higher if you're that high on Darian Mensah? There is one quarterback exactly that I am higher than all of the rest by a wide margin on, and that is, of course, Dante Moore of Oregon. And I said this before, if Mendoza didn't win the national championship and win the Heisman in 2025, Dante Moore is probably the number 1 overall pick in the NFL draft this year, and I think he very well should have been. He is easily, in my opinion, the most talented passer overall in college football. I think his only flaw as a quarterback is probably over aggressiveness to get the ball to some of his playmakers. We saw that led to 10 interceptions in 2025 for him. But even still with that, I don't think there is a quarterback better overall in terms of pure talent, in terms of mechanics. He has one of the best deep balls I've seen from a quarterback in recent memory. Obviously very accurate. We saw last year 72% passing, 3,500 yards, 30 touchdowns, and a 164 passer efficiency rating on Oregon, who was one of the most balanced teams in the sport last year. So it's not like they're letting him pass the ball 40, 50 times a game. He's making the most out of every opportunity. Like I said, 72% passing. It's hard to reach that 70% threshold, and Dante Moore did it while throwing for 3,500 yards. They do have a bit of a rebuild on offensive line, which will have a big impact on his game most likely. But like Mensah, the thing with Miami and the thing with Oregon, even if I think they regress overall on the front, they're still going to be very, very good. I don't think that becomes a detriment to their games. I don't think Dante Moore gets sacked 70 times this year and then he just sucks. I think the worst case scenario for both is that the running games for both Miami and Oregon take a slight step back. Obviously, with Oregon, it is much harder because they do lose Will Stein to Kentucky, so a bit of an unknown variable there. He also loses Kenyon Sadiq, which will probably end up playing a bigger impact than a lot of people may think. But like I said, overall, as an arm talent, as a passer, as a quarterback, I don't think there's anybody else better than Dante Moore in the sport. And if I were making my Heisman predictions today, I would honestly have to go Dante Moore to win in 2026. And with that being said, thank you for watching. As always, be sure to like and subscribe if you did enjoy it. Like I said at the beginning of the video, drop a comment on your top 10. Who do you think will be the best quarterback next year? I am dying to hear your guys' thoughts on this. And also, be sure to tune into next week's video, and I will see you there.